But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I'm very pleased to be doing this episode on the letter Vincent van Gogh writes to Joseph and Marie Ginoux. It's a couple that he knew in Arles. He rented the yellow house from them. I'm very excited about going through this letter. There are just some really useful revelations in this letter, and it's sort of harkening back to another life that he had, and it's almost like another version of Vincent van Gogh. In a way, he's had to mend his ways from that time. You know, he was perhaps ill-disciplined and needed to curb his behavior and control himself to some extent, be a bit more disciplined, and that is what I think he achieved in Arles. It was definitely a quieter community, a more settled community, and in a way kind of a more civilized place, just in terms of the well-to-do people there. Something that I've been wanting to raise, and I think this is a very good episode to raise it in, is why do you think a 37-year-old man was getting like pocket money from his younger brother? Why do you think Theo was sort of giving out sort of an allowance to his older brother? Do you think that came out of Theo's pocket? Do you think it was because Theo was a good guy? Do you think it was because of brotherly love or something like that? So by the end of this episode, I'm going to answer that question. Some of you may know the answer already, but this is a very important question to ask and to answer, and I think this is a good episode to do that. Before we get to that, I want to just remind you that on Patreon, the 13th episode and the final dealing with the transcript of the phone call between Kobach and Kissinger from August 17th, that's up. It's quite an interesting episode, just the conclusion there. The Kissinger tapes doesn't stop at this point. It goes on to August 21st in Kissinger tapes episode 14, so it'll probably go on easily to 30 episodes or so. Then in terms of the Madeleine McCann case, there's also a new post from a patron, and that's something that's quite unusual on Patreon. It's a really excellent post. It's really given me food for thought. Every time I want to make a video on Madeleine McCann, something else, some additional information comes to light that sort of makes me sort of feel like, whoa, I need to incorporate this in what I need to address, and so that is actually what's delaying everything. In any event, if you subscribe to this channel, you will see some additional content on Madeleine dealing with the latest information. And what is very interesting is the symbolic kind of snuffing out of the candle in Rothley, which is, it's almost as if the McCanns, without actually saying so, or indirectly saying, okay, well, we now accept that Madeleine's no longer alive. We're not going to investigate her as though she's still alive. We're going to kind of let it go. And it almost seems to be as if they're saying to the public the same thing. It's almost like the whole case has been closed with, I won't say fanfare, but a kind of circus where there's this sort of big song and dance about the suspect, and there's this incredible evidence, except it's like at the same time the one side of the coin is this incredible evidence, and then the other side is, well, there's actually no evidence. But I'm just saying this is the note on which to conclude the case. And I want to talk about it in more detail, but I'll do that in an episode on its own. and then one after that dealing with what I've been wanting to deal with for a while, the Smithman scenario, and how the McCanns dealt with the cadaver dogs. That is something that is just left completely out of the media narrative, which is quite laughable. The media is like puppets, and someone is just pulling their strings. And anyway, let's get to today's episode. And in today's episode, we are, in a weird way, we're going back to the Yellow House, just in terms of Vincent van Gogh writing a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Genu. Interestingly, the Yellow House, don't get confused between the Revue in Orvez, which in some pictures appears yellow. That's separate to the Yellow House in Arles. The best way to think about it is when you see photos of the building, well, that's the Revue in because it still stands. When you see paintings of the Yellow House, well, that's in Arles because that building no longer stands. So the place where Vincent stayed in Arles doesn't exist anymore. The place where he stayed in Orvez is kind of like a semi-museum. It's like a working museum. The restaurant is still functional, and there's a sort of a bookstore and a little souvenir shop kind of in the middle of the property. So that's all very much a tourist attraction, whereas the Yellow House, there's just nothing there. It's actually strange that they wouldn't like recreate the building, like rebuild something there, since it's such a signature thing. I was trying to find a photograph or a picture of Joseph Genu, just because there are so many of Marie Genu, especially painted by Vincent, and I came across the solitary painting by Paul Gogh of Joseph Genu, and funnily enough, when I googled it, I googled Joseph and Marie Genu van Gogh, and then this picture came up, and when I looked at it, I immediately thought, well, that's either a fake or it's definitely not Vincent van Gogh. He definitely didn't paint that. And so I was quite pleased to see that it was Gogh who painted it, because I just wouldn't have believed Vincent would paint in that style, just not him. It's not completely different, but it's just, you can kind of feel that it's there's something about it that is not Van Gogh, if that makes sense. So now we're going to sort of go into the letter. I've got good news, and that is on the 13th, Vincent actually writes a letter to Paul Gogh, and so that is what I love about all of these letters, is you get a kind of a sense of continuity. You don't just have a character coming up and then disappearing. You kind of have this, as I say, this sense of connectedness to all these different people and the different places. And that builds this into a very, very rich story. I can imagine some people who are interested in the very high-profile American cases from right now, listening to some of these videos, thinking, there's so much insignificant detail. Like, what is this actually getting at? But you're only going to get the full tapestry of it when you follow it from the beginning, and it is an incredible story. There are so many documentaries about this. There are so many books about it. It's no wonder that Van Gogh is such a famous artist. It's based on his own story that we've gotten to know him so well. Okay, and so without any further ado, let's go to the letter from Van Gogh to the Genus. And it was written on Wednesday, the 11th of June, 130 years ago today. And bear in mind that, do you remember Mrs. Genu's letter to him was Mr. Vincent, not Dear Vincent or anything like that, just Mr. Vincent. Van Gogh writes to them, my dear friends, Mr. and Mrs. Genu. Now bear in mind, he does want something from them, but he does seem to be a well-mannered guy. He's very seldom sarcastic, he's very seldom nasty in his letters. And you certainly don't get any self-pitying and sort of despair and moaning and groaning in his letters. You just don't get that. He seems to be optimistic. He seems to be motivated. He seems to be innovated or energetic, and he seems to be a man with a mission, a man with purpose, even despite the trials that he's going through. So in his letter, he writes, I want to reply straight away to Mrs. Janou's letter to say that I was really pleased to have news of you. I really regret that Mr. Janou has been injured and has suffered so much. Please have my things packed up by someone else so that he doesn't wear himself out with it. I'll gladly reimburse you for all the expenses you may have, but he mustn't tire himself too much for fear that his wound may open up. So, when Vincent says, I'll gladly reimburse you, it's not really him who's reimbursing, is it? It's Theo. It's the money coming from Theo. And as I said at the beginning, we're going to talk about why there's this sort of situation of an allowance and pocket money. And we'll deal with that a little bit further in this episode. He goes on to say, in this way, I'm counting on you sending on Saturday, for I'm awaiting it. So he's kind of, Vincent's kind of a polite guy, but he's also kind of a guy that doesn't really take that much shit, if that's the word. He sort of will be quite adamant about certain things, and he wants his furniture. He's not giving up. And then he is quite sort of conciliatory with him. He says, I too really regretted not being able to come back to Arles to take my leave of you all. In other words, to say goodbye. He says, for you well know that I had grown attached to people and things there with you with a sincere friendship. And I must say, while I was walking my dog today, I was just thinking about Van Gogh in a general way and just thinking, he is actually quite sincere. I mean, he's an intense fellow, but he's also quite a sincere fellow. And when you think about his letters to Theo, they are nothing if not sincere, and vice versa. They don't have nonsensical conversations. The conversations are sort of sincere and there's something authentic about them, just that they're real people and they mean what they say and they mean what they do, I guess. And I must also say that I don't think the Janous were very sincere friends. So whether Van Gogh had sincere relationships with people is one thing. Whether they had sincere friendships or relationships with him is another. Think about so many people in his life. Think about the Janous, who apparently, I've mentioned that in the previous episode, just how they, not the previous episode, the one before the previous episode, how there's a report that Mrs. Janou, despite her fake smile, she kind of betrayed Van Gogh and kind of had him kicked out because of his bad behavior. Bear in mind, he was like a tenant that was rowdy and that was causing them problems, and so they kind of, it seemed like they got rid of him, but didn't get rid of his furniture. So when he talks about sincere friendship, it might be sincere from his side, but is it really sincere from their side? Bear in mind, he's written them a bunch of letters and it's taken them quite a while to write back. He's written them a bunch of letters and it's taken them a while to do anything. So are they really such sincere friends? Did this thing with the bull really happen? Maybe it did, but maybe it didn't. The other thing is, think about his friendship with Gogh. Maybe Vincent has a sincere friendship with him. What about Gogh? You kind of have the same thing happening all the time. Vincent's sincere towards Gogh, wants to see him, goes out of his way. Gogh comes around. Gogh kind of seems to be quite a shallow guy. I mean, he's possibly got a deep side to him, but in terms of Vincent, I'm not sure if he's that good a friend. He certainly doesn't. Anyway, and then think about that in terms of Dr. Gachet. And to be fair, you can't just form a friendship like immediately. You meet someone and you sort of instant friends. A real friendship has got to be tested. A real friendship has got to experience strains and troubles and arguments, and then you make the effort to kind of patch them up. A real friendship stands the test of time. A real friendship stands up to scrutiny and to strain. When someone confronts you and says, you haven't been a good friend to me, and you say, I'm sorry, I will, let me work on that. I remember as a very young man, I had a really good-looking friend. This was when I was, I guess, the early days of university, and this guy kept having girlfriends, and every time he got a girlfriend, he'd disappear. Just like suddenly we would stop phoning and we wouldn't do stuff together, and you'd get used to it, but it would also be like, wow, are you schizophrenic? Like, so a girl comes along and suddenly you forget your friends, kind of thing. And eventually he kind of got the memo, and he was like, okay, look, I'll try and remain a friend and also be this sort of Don Juan kind of thing. And I remember that quite well. But I think all of us are capable of that, where you have friendships, especially when you're young, and then when you meet someone of the opposite sex, you almost forget everybody else, like literally everyone. It takes a while to sort of balance your new relationships with certain people with maintaining relationships with others. And obviously you do go to the trouble to keep certain friendships alive, and some friendships seem to just be sort of self-sustaining in a way. They're things that draw you to people, the things that you have in common, and you maintain certain relationships. I'm just saying that my impression is that Vincent van Gogh was more sincere than most of the people around him. And I think his brother was one of the more sincere people around him, which is why they had a particularly good relationship, right? But if you think about Dr. Gachet, how sincere was that relationship? You might say it was very sincere from Vincent's side, and maybe the doctor meant well, but a test was about to come up in their relationship, and we're going to look at that. So he goes on to say, in the final days, I was more catching the illness of the others than curing my own. The society of the other patients influenced me badly, and in the end I no longer understood anything about it. So I think what Vincent's talking about here is in the final days at Saint-Remy, not the final days at the Yellow House. He's saying that in the final days, the reason I didn't come to say goodbye was I was actually catching the illnesses of others. And I don't know what he means by that. I don't know if he means he was literally catching like the flu, or that they were driving him crazy or whatever, or that he just wasn't very happy. But he's basically just saying that being there was actually sickening him, and just wasn't good for him. And he says the society of other patients influenced me badly. I can imagine that. I can imagine, that's just not a very good environment for him to concentrate, even though he did produce Starry Night there, some incredible artwork. A very simultaneously a very peaceful and seminal artwork. I mean, it's one that's filled with energy, but there's also a kind of a peacefulness about it, isn't there? I remember when I investigated, or I went to write about another artist called Father Clarote, a Belgian artist who came to work in South Africa in the Free State, and he became just like a really well-known artist. And I went to see a woman who knew him personally, and I asked her about him, and she she said a word in Afrikaans that I've never forgotten. It doesn't really have an English translation, one that's appropriate to the Afrikaans word. But anyway, the word that she used was saligheid. And saligheid, she was just talking about how he would experience this incredible peace in the country, where he would sort of experience the almost like God's grace, or God's peace at night, with the stars coming out over, the African fields and so on. It's difficult to explain that sort of authentic sentiment that she's talking about when she talks about zaligheid. You would need to see the look in her face and hear the tone of her voice and that whole context when she was talking about it. But this guy, Father Claro, he was actually a priest, and he actually kind of turned all the scenes that he was seeing into kind of biblical themes. So there are a lot of donkeys in the Free State, there are a lot of sunflowers, there are a lot of African women, and so he turned all of those into a biblical theme. It wasn't just a donkey on a field, it was actually one of the donkeys in Bethlehem. It wasn't just a black woman holding a baby, it was almost like an African Maria Magdalena. The sunflower wasn't just a sunflower, this is in terms of Father Claro, it was a holy thing. It was like an artifact from God saying, be happy, you're being blessed on earth, my sun is shining through these flowers, in your world, in these fields, whatever. So if there's a equivalent to Van Gogh kind of in South Africa, I'm not saying is exactly the same because it's different, but there was also a guy in South Africa who was into these sunflowers, and that was Father Claro. And to me, the picture, the painting Starry Night, evokes the sense of zaligheid. And I guess the closest word to zaligheid in English is salvation, right? Now think about Starry Night and this feeling of salvation. Think about Starry Night and Van Gogh looking out from his asylum window, which is almost like a prison window, and just seeing this beauty and almost munificence in what he's seeing around him. Like just this quiet little town with this cypress coming out of it whispering, and the stars, and just the munificence of God allowing life to do what it wants to do, if that makes sense. And it's another word for bountifulness, open-handedness, magnanimity. But to come back to the salvation, that's something Simon Sharma, who introduces each of these videos, it comes from The Power of Art, where he talks about Van Gogh. But in that same documentary, Simon Sharma talks about the actual message in all of Van Gogh's art is a sense of soothing the human spirit in the face of death, almost as if his artworks are like being preached to in church and being soothed that life is bountiful and that God cares about you, or something like that. That God's will is in the world and God's light is in the countryside, and that's a kind of zaligheid that comes through in Starry Night. Does that make sense? But there's also something tragic about it, because Vincent may have seen that and experienced that, but almost from the other side. He can't reach that because he's in the asylum. It's out there, but he's stuck in there. He's stuck inside those walls and with the despair and the people crying out. And he wants to be part of that Saligheid, right? Which I think he did sort of reach out to and kind of experience in Orvez. So what is really interesting in this letter is he's reflecting, but from the perspective of no longer being there, about what was happening to him. And it's in very general terms. He just refers to an illness. And he says that he no longer understood anything about it. He just wasn't very happy where he was. And I think it's a little bit like, I know when I went overseas for the first time, I was with a girlfriend, and it was the first time that I was sort of working, and it was the first time that I wasn't training like on a daily basis. And I didn't really understand what was happening to me. I would sometimes stand in a queue at a supermarket and get really, really, really upset and impatient. And what was happening was I was used to all the natural energy in me, that sort of youthful energy, draining out in very intense workouts when I was in South Africa. And as soon as I was in the UK and I was no longer working out, all of that energy was building up. And I no longer had an outlet. And my girlfriend was sort of too young to sort of realize, and in a weird way, I didn't see it either. But that you're sort of seeing, wow, you don't have an outlet. Your energy is just all the stress is just accumulating, and you normally had a way that you could sort of how can I put it? There's normally a way that it could just flow in and flow out. Now it is flowing in and not flowing out, kind of thing. And so it took me a while to understand what was happening to me, and it took her, well, I'm not sure if she ever understood, but I think it's something like that was happening to him, is he couldn't understand what was happening to him because he's an artist, and he's trying to figure out what he's trying to figure out in terms of the art, and then he's got this dysfunctional society around him that is just irrational, and in his loneliness it's becoming hard to understand what's going on. And within that, where is the illness? Where's the beginning and end of it? Can you see it's quite difficult to actually figure out? I mean, where does the illness end and the unhappiness start? Do you see what I'm saying? Then he says, I felt that it was better to try a change. And anyway, the pleasure of seeing my brother, his family, and our painter friends again has done me good up till now. And I feel absolutely calm and in a normal state. So this is Van Gogh's kind of assessment of how he was cured. It was basically, he felt like he just needed a change. And as soon as he saw his family and he sort of reconnected with proper society, a society that would sort of embrace him, he felt normal. He felt fine. He felt healthy. He felt mentally well. Everything was the way that he sort of wanted it to be. And I think one can also say the fact that he felt that he needed a change, he saved himself. He was the one that diagnosed that and kind of recognized that, and it took a while to convince everyone else, and then it worked. I mean, he went to Paris without a hitch. He arrived in Orvez, set up his home, and everything had been going fine for a couple of weeks now. And he gives his sort of bill of health to the Chinese, saying, I'm absolutely calm and in a normal state. It's another way of saying I'm healthy. But the words he's using is almost saying, I'm not, what's the opposite of being calm? Well, it's being hysterical. It's being out of control. It's being perhaps intoxicated. What's the opposite of a normal state? What's the opposite of, say, being sober? Well, it's being drunk or being crazed or being, just out of control. So he's saying, well, now he's calm and normal. It suggests that when he was in the Yellow House, he was emotional, abnormal, a bit of an animal in a way, in the same way that Gogh probably was, just carrying on, Do you get what I'm getting at? That it's probably referring to two men kind of going out on the town, too often two artist men, and having fun. And now he's learned his lesson, and now instead of doing that where he is now, is calm and he's normal, right? And then he mentions Dr. Gogh, and he says, the doctor here says that one must throw oneself fully into work and distract oneself in that way. And once again, he's basically just saying the treatment that he's getting from Dr. Gogh is simply work. Now, can you imagine if he had some kind of real serious illness? Now we're talking about a physical illness. Would a doctor say to him, wow, dude, you need to get up every day and work? I don't think so. Someone who's physically ill, you wouldn't say that if you knew that person was physically ill. If they were mentally ill, would you say that? Maybe. You might say, you need to have purpose, you need to have some discipline in your mind, you need to concentrate on that, and that'll keep you from, and so I can tell you that exercise, there's some moments where I have difficulties, I guess is the way to put it, and I've always dealt with it through exercise, right? And this is, I think, similar, where he says he should just throw himself into work and distract himself in that way. Distract himself from what? Well, possibly his loneliness, possibly his struggles with his work. And so he's basically just saying work hard, and I've heard the saying happiness is something to do. And I think it's so true. I think obviously it's better if the thing that you're doing is kind of constructive and you enjoy it and it's got some utility for other people. But I think the opposite is also true. Unhappiness is idleness. Unhappiness is laziness. Unhappiness is not doing anything and not wanting to do anything. Unhappiness is being stuck. Unhappiness is not knowing what to do. And I think there are millions of people out there now who possibly lost their jobs, who are uncertain, who are idle. And my advice to them is give yourself a job. Give yourself something to do. Employ yourself. I mean, it's literally give yourself work. That's what I did. I mean, nobody told me to write 100 books. I told myself to do it. And, anyway, so that is the amazing diagnosis, but with a little bit of perspective, Van Gogh gives to the Genoese about his time in Saint-Rémy. And is he having difficulty talking about it? Is he talking about it with bitterness? Is he talking about it with, is it a big moan? No. It's crystal clear in simply just saying, well, this is what happened and this is what I did and things are working out really well. Again, is he in Arles, having left Saint-Rémy, is he like going downhill? Has it been a big disaster and that's going to end in him committing suicide? Not at all. So if we go on through the letter, he says, the latter knows a lot about painting. This is Dr. Gogh, and he says, and likes mine very much. He encourages me a great deal, and 2-3 times a week he comes to spend a few hours with me to see what I'm doing. Now, so that's giving us an idea just how often Van Gogh and Gogh sort of hang out. It's almost every second day. And I'm not quite sure what it means when he says he comes to spend a few hours with me. Does it mean Dr. Gogh goes to the Revue Inn? I don't think it means that. Does it mean Dr. Gogh goes out into the field where Vincent's painting? I don't think it really means that, although maybe it did happen here and there. I think what it means is Vincent would be at Dr. Gauch's house, possibly invited, possibly he would just be there anyway, And then the doctor would also be there, and then the doctor would say, how do you paint this and how do you do that, right? And because he wants to learn, the doctor wants to learn about art. The doctor is a wannabe artist himself. He's not that interested in being a doctor. And given what ultimately happened to Vincent, the fact that he died very soon after coming to this doctor's care, maybe it was a good thing he did leave the profession. But the point is, this doctor really wanted to be, he sort of loved the sort of vibe and the atmosphere and the whole scenario around the circumstances around artists, and he wanted that for himself. He wanted that sense of, that almost magical sense of being an artist. And I know I had that as a writer. I just thought it was something incredible that you could produce something like that out of your mind, and that you could almost project your thoughts into the minds of others, and sometimes, in some cases, the minds of millions of others, and that you could reach into the hearts and you could change some people's worlds, and maybe even ultimately change the world. I mean, an author like J.K. Rowling, surely she has changed the world in a way. So Van Gogh's in a very good place. He's with someone who, he says, encourages him, and he's in a good place, I guess. And then he talks about the reviews he's gotten, and he says they've twice written an article about my paintings, once in a Paris newspaper and the other time in Brussels, where I had exhibited. That's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, because as far as I understand it, the other article in Brussels was, I think, a translation of the French article. In other words, the same article published in Brussels. So it's not necessarily two articles or two reviews. It's the same one, just translated, if we want to be very accurate about it. And then he talks about now lately again in a newspaper of my own country, Holland. So he's saying that there were 3 reviews written about him, in Paris, Brussels and Holland. And that review refers to an article from a guy called Isaacson on, I think he wrote an article called De Portefeuille of Kunst, something like that. And he says, Vincent writes, that means that a lot of people have been to see my paintings and that I've sold on better terms. And it isn't over. It's anyway certain that since I've stopped drinking, I've done better work than before. There's still that which has been gained. So this is an incredible paragraph. It's just where, and you don't see it that often, where Van Gogh is kind of endorsing himself. He's kind of pitching himself, trying to sort of say how well things are going. And in terms of this, he refers to these reviews, and then he says, my paintings are being sold on better terms as a result. Also not strictly true, he's just sold really one picture. And then he says, it isn't over. I mean, how's that for someone who's suicidal? It's not over. 48 days before his death, he's saying, it's not over. This thing that I'm doing, this project that I'm working on, it's not over. And he says, it's anyway certain that since I stopped drinking, I've done better work than before. And there's still that which has been gained. So he's saying, things are improving. I've stopped drinking and my work's improving. And, those words that he uses where he says, since I stopped drinking, he's saying that in a quite a familiar way. And what I mean is, I think that he knows that the Genoos knew that he was drinking a lot. So he's kind of almost stopping them or interrupting what they would think of him and say, you know what, I'm not drinking anymore. I've changed. I've turned a new leaf in a way, and I'm working harder and working better, I'm having success. He seems to be trying to convince them of that is recovered his sobriety, and he's recovered a bit of his not reputation, but he's recovered his self-respect or self-esteem or something like that. I've stopped drinking, I don't need to do that anymore. And this is where I want to raise quite an important point. I said in a previous episode that how would you depict loneliness? Like, if you wanted to make a movie, how would you depict it? And this is, I think, the utter failure of the movies that have depicted Vincent in the past, which is, if you wanted to really tell his story, you would want to show that when he was in Arles and he was happy, he would probably drink to excess. When he, in other words, to celebrate life, to celebrate the birth of his brother's child, whatever, to celebrate Christmas, to celebrate whatever, he would drink. When he was not happy, he would also drink. So he would drink when he was happy and drink when he was sad, and he would drink excessively. And this brings us back to the question, why is his brother giving him like an allowance? Like, why is it like every week he gets a little bit more money? Why is that happening? And again, you might say, well, it's his brother just looking after him. If you know the story of Van Gogh well, then you know that everybody inherited money when his father died. His father was a clergyman. In those days, a pastor earned a bit of money. A good pastor was kind of quite a powerful fellow, and you were given a house and so on. And so when Vincent's father died, all the children, everybody inherited money, and Vincent kind of went off the deep end. He went to Paris, and he went to brothels, and while he was living with Theo, he would behave badly at times. And what eventually happened was they basically decided, look, I'm gonna take your inheritance. This is Theo, and I'm going to give you small amounts like pocket money, because you can't handle it. You can't hold yourself back. You can't moderate your behavior. You're going to waste all of this money if you have access to it. So I'm going to give, and this isn't Theo giving Vincent his own money or money out of his own pocket. It's Theo managing Vincent's inheritance. And then you say, why? Why doesn't he do that? Because Vincent's got a drinking problem. That's his illness. And if you take the drinking problem away, is he still ill? No, he's not ill anymore because he's not drinking. Right? Now, I'm not saying that the full scope of his illness was his drinking. I'm saying that was just a part of it. He did have syphilis. But the thing that was ruining his life effectively was the consumption of absinthe. And that's why he says here, since I stopped drinking, I've done better work than before, and there's still that which has been gained. And here's the fascinating insight, is the innkeeper's daughter, Adeline Ravoux. I think she was 13, 14 years old when Vincent arrived at the Ravoux Inn. She said she recalled Van Gogh never drank alcohol. Never. Not like he drank a little bit, he just didn't drink it at all. So it's kind of, at the Yellow House he drank to excess and made a mess of things. And there was a big altercation and he lost his ear. Do you think that he cut his own ear off when he got drunk, or that he was such a mean, horrible drunk that someone eventually cut his ear off and ran away from him? Because he was just such a... Anyway, so he went from that to Alves, and now he's going to behave properly, and he's going to do that, he's going to achieve that, he's going to return to respectability by staying off the thing that he knows is not good for him, which is the alcohol. And you could make the argument, well, that was true for now. What about later on? Well, we'll see. I mean, maybe later on he was tempted. Maybe later on he did drink. We'll see, won't we? We'll see what Theo says to him. We'll see what the Dr. Gachet says about him to Theo. We'll see what happens, won't we? He goes on to say, I still often think of you all, and one can't do as one wants in life. One must leave the place one feels most attached to, but the memories remain, and one remembers obscurely as in a mirror absent friends. Now again, if you're going to talk about this guy having a mental illness or being mad or being sort of crazy, that's such a lucid sentence. And it's such a well-expressed sentiment given the context of what he's going through at this time. He talks about, I still think often of you all. One can't do as one wants in life. One must leave the place one feels most attached to and, try again and whatever. And that's exactly what he did. And that's something that he did often in his life. He left home very young. He's one of the youngest people to work for the art dealership Groupil. He was very young when he went to London. That's where I think he started his whoring, whatever. And he would often be somewhere and then have to leave there because things weren't working out, and that kept happening. And he's just done it now again. He's just left. He was kind of forced to leave Arles, but then he left Saint-Remy. Even though at one point he felt safe in this cage, the cage eventually became a cage, right? Anyway, he refers to them as absent friends, which I think is quite a compliment to the Jinus, especially given how they treated him. And then he says, thus I hope that the dispatch can take place on Saturday. And he's basically saying the dispatch being that you can send off my furniture on Saturday by the weekend. He says, here's the address again, Vincent van Gogh at Revus, Place de la Marie, Auvers-sur-Oise, by goods train. And then there's sort of a postscript where he says, in this way there can't be any mistakes. And I thank you in advance for your trouble, but let Ginu get a man to do the packing and not wear himself out. I shall reimburse you the costs. Wishing you good health and complete recovery. Most cordial greetings, Vincent van Gogh. So although it's been hinted at this problem with absinthe and alcohol, here we have it from the horse's mouth, from Van Gogh himself, admitting that he had a drinking problem while he was in Arles. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to see that. It's there in black and white. You do need to spend a bit of time with his letters. And you need to see them in context, because if you saw it just once, you might say, it's maybe not such a big deal. Well, it is. It is a big deal. As I mentioned earlier, in the next episode, we're going to deal with Vincent's letter to Paul Gogh, and we'll see if we can fathom a kind of a different, or intuit a different kind of tone. Bear in mind, Gogh is kind of a bad boy, and is Vincent going to sort of admit to certain impulses and appetites and things that he wishes he could do? Is he going to allude to any of that in his letter to Gogh? Well, we're about to find out. That is on the 13th, which is when that letter was written 130 years ago on that day. So we'll deal with that on the 13th. I think on the same day he also wrote letters to his mother and sister Wilhelmine as well. So we'll try and get through those on the 13th, which is Saturday. So that's something to look forward to on the weekend. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.